Mandy was really outgoing. She was an amazing person. She taught me how to ride bikes, and we played dolls and went on trips to Tennessee.
Mandy was very quirky. She was always being funny, being more silly than funny. You know what I mean? She always tried to make you laugh. That was how she came across. She had a real personality. My grandfather was a pastor of our local church. We went to church. It was like Wednesday night Bible study, Saturday night, choir practice, Sunday morning service, night service. So that was a big part of our weeks.
You had to make sure you lived by the Bible. If you didn't, it was a sin.
Paul LeMay met Mandy online. They met on Facebook. Paul LeMay came down to Eastern Kentucky by way of Massachusetts. I think Paul was very smitten by Mandy. I think he was very attracted to the idea that a woman so far away wanted him, and that's what precipitated his relocation to Eastern Kentucky.
The trouble was, she knew nothing of him.
Paul was older. He was 47 or 48. He'd already lived life, so in her mind, she thought he was smarter about things.
Mandy liked that he was different, not from around here. Paul would come every other weekend to come take her to church.
Paul was portrayed to me as a religious person and a good guy. He was this big Christian guy who was really nice. I was happy for her. She had said that they had things in common, that they could actually talk to each other for a long time. She seemed happy, and that made me happy.
They dated about 7 months at the most. And then they got married.
From what she had told me, the reason she married Paul so quick was because they were trying to do things right. It was just a little small wedding, just a few people from that church that they went to.
It was a 15-minute ceremony. It wasn't nothing fancy. My grandparents thought it was a good thing, too, to get married to Paul. They liked that he had a job, could provide for her, and had 2 vehicles.
Paul didn't have much family nearby. None of his family was there, I know that. Looking back, that was very weird to me. I've personally never met none of Paul's family.
Paul LeMay has this mysterious past where we don't know a lot about his background, and that may be by design. It's possible that he doesn't want Mandy or her family or anybody to know a lot about him. It's interesting because we have someone who, on one hand, has estranged or distant relationships from family members, but on the other hand, has an identified loved one that they've idolized. It sets itself up for problems in the future.
Paul and Mandy lived in Oil Springs, Sayersville, Kentucky. Just a little town, a back road. Paul, he worked at a nursing home, and he brought home the money.
He paid for the home that they lived in.
She didn't have to work at all, Mandy didn't. He'd made sure she had everything she needed, didn't let her go without. At first, Paul seemed like a good man, from what I seen anyway.
But sometimes Paul would say a lot of negative things on Facebook. That may have been his way to get his point across, was through social media. Say the things on there that he couldn't say in person.
It's a Facebook post from Paul. All my life I've been called no good, that I'm worthless, that I will never amount to anything. I finally had enough and I came here to Kentucky, where I've got myself a home that I paid for. I have a beautiful, loving wife, and anyone says otherwise, they are a liar.
He was very fragile. I could see that. He never opened up, wouldn't talk. Maybe there was a reason behind it. There was a madness in his old life that I didn't know about.
Paula May's Facebook posts say to me that this is someone who's vulnerable and identifies with this role of someone who's been victimized and has to take on the world.
At the time, me and my husband had separated. My children were tiny. Mandy, she's like, if you want to, you can come here, you can stay with me and Paul. She's like, we can spend time together, get back to being sisters. And so in my mind, it was an awesome idea because I loved Mandy. She was my best friend.
Mandy, she loved her hair dye. She started dyeing her hair crazy colors. It was blue, purple, and one time she messed it up and it was half blonde, half blue.
One time we were gonna dye both of our hair that same night. And we was gonna go out and get the hair dyed. And Paul wouldn't allow us to do it. Paul, it wasn't a necessary thing, so she wasn't allowed to do it.
Why was that?
I don't know why he wouldn't allow her to do it. I'm trying to answer these for you, but I can't find a rhyme to the reason of why he wouldn't let her. I suppose he treated her like a child.
The fact that Paul LeMay's relationship with Mandy appears to be more like that of a father and a daughter is indicative of his controlling nature. It's also interesting that in this day and age, where social media and videos of one another are very common, that there's actually very little of that with Paul LeMay and Mandy. If he can control the little day-to-day tasks that she does, he can ultimately control her life.
Paul would work and he would come home and I would say, hi, Paul. He would say hello, and that was it. He would always lock himself in his bedroom.
The folks who are quiet and brooding and kind of seething underneath, those are the folks that you may least expect, but who could prove to be the most dangerous.
He would always lock himself in his bedroom. I thought it was weird. He wouldn't associate with the rest of us. Nobody really knew what was going on in there. Paul could be quiet, Paul could be shy. Behind closed doors, Paul could be a creep. He would lock himself in there like a hermit crab. One time she had opened the door and asked him what he wanted for supper, and he told her, I don't care what we have for supper, I don't care if we effing eat or not. In my mind, she was trying to take care of him and do what a wife should be doing for a husband. And he was straight up disrespectful to her.
This is Mandy at a rough time. About 25, probably. This looks like the time she had gotten arguments with Paul.
A lot of the times they would argue. They would argue in the bedroom, in their room. And we tried to stay away from that because I had kids and I didn't want them to hear that. So we always tried to stay out of the arguments. It was always behind that bedroom door. Mandy would go in her room, she would come back out and she'd be like, oh, it's happened again. Paul, he's in one of his moods.
But she chose to stay.
I don't know why she chose to stay, but I think a lot of it is that she was actually building a home and building a life. And it's just like, to her, it was nothing. Like she'd grown used to it.
There's indication that the arguments between Paul and Mandy are escalating. It begs the question of, what's happening there. Is it that he feels he's losing control and his own insecurity is knocking at the door? When someone like Paul doesn't feel in control, he may lash out impulsively.
One day we was going up to see Mom, and we had made it from Sayersville to Prestonsburg, and we made it that far before he had called her on his break, and there was a heated argument to the point that she pulled over and we turned around and went back. Anytime Mandy had to do anything, she had to run it by Paul and make sure Paul was okay with it. He had come home from work and he said he wasn't feeling good, so he went in there and he laid down and went to sleep. And so me and Mandy and the kids had went out to Walmart. And he was so mad when we come back because she had left without saying something to him that she actually went into the room and wasn't allowed back. She didn't come back out that night.
Here's a situation where Paul is about 20 years older than Mandy, yet he has effectively grounded her. When individuals are that controlling and domineering, it makes you wonder what else is happening behind closed doors.
Felt like she was trapped in a prison. Mandy would say things like, I feel like I'm in jail sometimes. Paul was very controlling. The last 2 or 3 months that I stayed there, we didn't really go anywhere or do anything. Pretty much the only thing he allowed Mandy to do was to do the grocery shopping.
He wouldn't let her go anywhere and do anything or see anyone. But when she stopped coming around, I knew something was up.
Several times I told Mandy that she didn't have to put up with that. She could leave, but she never would listen. It's like it was her relationship. I needed to butt out of it. It wasn't any of my business. Me and the kids would stay in that room on the opposite side from where her and Paul would stay. We just kept them back there unless they needed to come out and use the bathroom. It was like we were walking on eggshells, so to speak, tiptoeing around the house. I wish I would have stepped in and done something because I feel like I could have helped her out. And I wish I'd just let her know that I cared more. You know what I mean? I wish I got her out of there.
Paul is this quiet fella who keeps to himself. But as time goes on, his Facebook posts start to get more aggressive.
Last night was a tough night. I cried most of the night. The enemy wanting me to do something, but I was strong enough not to do it. Hopefully today is a better day. Now I kind of beat myself up for not putting them on my Facebook. I've never seen these.
It just hurts me. I've not seen those.
From a religious perspective, Paul may be referring to the enemy as Satan. It's also possible that the enemy is his rage, his insecurity. This is an example of an individual who seems to be fighting to control their behavior.
This Facebook post is Paul is really trying to bury those demons and keep himself from crossing that line from verbal aggression to physical aggression.
Had I seen this at the time, I'd been angry. I'd tried to help her.
It begs the question, what kind of threats could Paul LeMay have been making behind closed doors? Regardless of which way we go, we're heading into the abyss. Things are about to get worse.
One day, one of the kids had climbed up on the table and had knocked over a couple of plates and cups that was sitting on the table from when they were eating. Paul, he didn't really explode or anything. He went into the room, he had hollered for Mandy to come in there, and I don't know what was happening to Mandy. Like I said, she was in that room, they were locked in there, I don't know. They were in there for over an hour, and when they came out, they had got a change or two of clothes for each one of them, and she told me that they'd be back. That's when Paul and Mandy had left there. I could tell something was wrong. Not often my sister calls me crying. She told me she was scared for him to be around the kids. If I didn't get the kids out of there before they got back, that something was gonna happen. He might hurt them or something.
There's increasing evidence that Paul LeMay is becoming unraveled. That's particularly worrisome because individuals who threaten or hurt children tend to lack remorse and empathy for others.
It did kind of scare me at that point. So the best thing for me to do for my kids was to leave. When I left there with the kids, things with Paul and Mandy got a lot worse.
The trouble was, Paul would act normal sometimes. Sometimes he didn't seem like a bad guy at all. He was nice, he was polite. To me, it was strange.
We're seeing this Jekyll and Hyde personality. We have someone who's on one hand saying, Mandy, I love you, my beautiful wife. And on the other hand, someone who is controlling her, potentially threatening children, not giving her money to go to the store. So we see these two diametrically opposed personality behaviors, and that's actually quite common in individuals who perpetrate interpersonal violence.
There was a couple months after I moved out, she was telling me that he was getting a lot more aggressive. She was telling me that Paul was starting to be more physical with her. Started out with him shoving her, and then it got to where he would get in her face and he would get more violent with her. She said she was scared that if she didn't get out of there, that she wouldn't get out of there. She called me and told me she did leave Paul. She was at a friend's house, that she was scared of him and that she didn't want to go back home. She told me they were good people, she was safe. I didn't really question it. She was out of the bad situation, so in my mind, she was good. And she told me she was going to come over for Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving is really important to our family because it's the only time we actually sit down around the table and gather around and pray over the food.
I was excited. I'm not gonna lie, it's been months since I got to see my sister, so I was excited.
The family are ready to eat Thanksgiving dinner. Dinner comes and goes, but there's no Mandy.
Nobody could get a hold of her. Nobody knew exactly where she was. I was the last one to know where she was, and she was supposed to be at that friend's house.
As the minutes turn to hours, the hours turn to days, I could imagine a whole host of thoughts, running through their head about where Mandy might be. Maybe she's in the hospital. Maybe she's just out having a good time. Maybe Mandy's gone to see somebody else for Thanksgiving, and maybe she'll turn back up.
Couldn't believe what happened next. Mandy had told me she was at a friend's house and she was safe. But then we wasn't having no luck getting hold of her. I tried contacting her phone, her Facebook, her messenger, and she just would not answer. I didn't even know where to start to go to look. I had went out and I had printed off some photos to give the state police.
The uncertainty of it all was a very terrifying moment for that family, just not knowing. Despite the family's concern over Mandy being gone for 2 to 3 weeks, on December 17, there's a post on her Facebook account.
I needed to get away from the drama and dry myself out. I will contact the ones in my family after the first of the year.
I knew reading that day that wasn't Mandy.
I love you. Please understand I'm going through hard times right now, but I will contact you after the first. Love you later.
That's words of an alcoholic. Mandy wasn't an alcoholic and didn't have to dry herself out. Everything in this is spelled exactly as it should be, down to every last apostrophe and everything, and Mandy always spelled things very weird. Her spelling was never correct, and everything in this was right. And so, reading this when it came out, everybody knew something was wrong. Everybody knew that wasn't Mandy.
Homer then contacted Paul asking where Mandy was, what was going on. Homer asked him if it was them that posted that on there. Paul wouldn't speak back. Dad was mad. He's trying to find his sister. After a while, Paul says, I ain't heard from her in weeks either. That's when Dad got mad and called the cops.
Thompson.
Yes, ma'am. I was wondering, how do I go about filing a missing person report?
Okay, what's going on?
Okay, my sister, her and her husband had split up, and nobody has seen her since the day before Thanksgiving.
Who is your sister?
Mandy Ann King LeMay.
Okay, and what's your name?
Homer King.
Okay, and she's married?
Yes. He's telling us that he hasn't seen her since the day before Thanksgiving either.
Okay, I'll have a trooper make contact with you, okay?
Okay, I appreciate it.
Homer was really annoyed at Paul. He was wanting to know where Mandy was, but she ain't spoke to nobody in over 3 weeks.
We know from the evidence so far that Mandy has been controlled by Paul. And the family's probably thinking maybe it's just their relationship. It's very possible that Paul has Mandy trapped inside the house.
When the trooper arrives to Mandy and Paul's residence, he goes up onto the porch. The blinds are drawn, he can't see inside the residence. He hears a series of what he describes as thumps. It sounded like someone was moving around in the home, but nobody ever came to the door. So that trooper immediately radios for backup. Paul is in fact inside the residence and he's not coming out of the residence. The Kentucky State Police show up very quickly. It has escalated into a barricaded subject who's refusing to come out and respond to law enforcement commands and who is known to own a .22 caliber handgun. They were concerned that Mandy was being held inside the residence. As the Kentucky State Police are trying to get Paul LeMay to cooperate with their commands, they're looking for folks, neighbors, who might have any means to contact Paul. One of the neighbors happens to have Paul LeMay on Facebook Messenger. And Paul responds. Paul's still refusing to come out of the residence. But as the time goes on, Paul wants a cigarette. The Kentucky State Police tell Paul, "You've got to come to us." Paul is very reluctant to do this. So the neighbor, Pat, volunteers to take the cigarette to Paul, who's standing on the porch. Now, at this time, when Paul comes out of the residence, Paul LeMay is dressed in nothing but sweatpants and no shirt. It's December 17 in Kentucky. It's very cold, so the next door neighbor, Pat, also offers his sweatshirt. As soon as Paul LeMay gets that sweatshirt, he is rushed by 2 troopers who are laying in wait, and that's how the Kentucky State Police eventually got Paul into custody. The state police begin a sweep of the LeMay residence to look for Mandy. At that point, they had no idea whether she was dead or alive. When the troopers walked into the LeMay residence, they were met by the smell of death. They could smell decomposition in the air. When they get into this back bedroom, they can make out a pile of blankets, and sticking out from the bottom of that blanket is what is obviously a human foot. They pull the sheets back, and there they find the deceased body of Mandy LeMay. She had a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. What's clear, at this point, she had been there for quite some time.
I got a call from Daddy. He said, she's gone. She won't be coming back. I fell to the floor. My whole body was paralyzed for 3 days after that.
I never knew she went back there to even think that could have happened. I'm done. That's as far as I want to go.
A family in Johnson County is wishing they would have seen the signs after police say their family member, Mandy LeMay, was shot and killed by her husband.
Paul LeMay's statements to Kentucky State Police during his recorded interview tells us that Paul was obviously in a very troubled place.
I just want you to tell me what happened.
You know what happened. You want me to come out and say it? I'll say it. Yes, I killed her. I didn't want to. I loved the woman, damn it.
My guess is that Paul did it so that nobody else could have her, and she couldn't leave him.
It's gonna come out that I'm the bad guy no matter what. They're gonna take her side over me.
Paul clearly identifies as the victim. Individuals who fail to take responsibility for their own actions are some of the same individuals who are callous and lack empathy and remorse.
She would have been alive now if she wouldn't have went back. But Mandy couldn't make up her mind whether she loved him or not.
I'm gonna be betrayed as a monster.
You want to tell me how you done it?
We learned through the course of the investigation, Mandy had left the marital residence and hadn't returned for quite some time. But eventually, Mandy LeMay returns home.
I just sat on the couch looking at her.
She tells Paul that she's lost her telephone. She doesn't have one, and she needs a means of communications. She wants to be able to reach out to her family and set up this plan to go spend Thanksgiving with her family, to have dinner with them.
She wanted to use a phone. She was talking to someone.
We know that Paul LeMay is in the house at that time, and he is likely hearing these conversations take place. He understands that in a few more days, when Thanksgiving rolls around, Mandy's going to be back out the door again, spending time with her family, and eventually an argument between the two ensues.
At this point, Paul knows that he's lost Mandy. He's lost control of the one person in his life, the source of his ego. And now we can see that the dark impulses are going to seep back in. It's almost like a volcano erupting. This is the last straw.
What little bit of heart I had left for her, it just went away.
The evidence in this case shows that Paul LeMay went to his bedroom.
What kind of gun was it, Paul?
A .22 revolver.
He took that revolver into the living room, He put that gun to the back of Mandy LeMay's head, and he pulled that trigger.
Well, from what I was told, he shot her in the back bedroom and dragged her to their bed, and he slept next to her those several weeks that she was laying there.
In the very end, after she died, Paul still didn't want to let her go. This is indicative of yet another final opportunity for him to control her.
I reckon Paul was trying to preserve the body because he literally slept in a freezing house next to her. So y'all had the funeral. It's hard for me to walk through the funeral doors. I walked out when I seen the casket and it was closed. I didn't even get to tell her goodbye.
I could have got Mandy out. Mandy could have been safe. Mandy could be here with us now.
It would have been nice if Mandy could have met my children more. I could explain to them better of how good of a person she was. How good of an aunt she would have been, how much they would have been spoiled. It hurts me every day that she can't be here with us today.
Paul was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists, both of whom cleared him as competent to stand trial.
You swear the testimony about to give us the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yeah, I do.
Your name?
Paul LeMay.
Grand jury charges that on or about November 20, 2018, you committed the death of Mandy LeMay by shooting her in the head, which caused her death, that being a charge of murder. You wish to enter into a guilty plea based on the Commonwealth's offer on plea of guilt.
Yes.
If I accept your plea,
Paul LeMay didn't actually go to trial. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder, 1 count of abuse of a corpse.
Judge, on behalf of Mr. LeMay, he declines to make a statement other than to say that the truth that he would tell wouldn't be believed by anyone.
It's still very frustrating that he couldn't explain to everybody in court why he did do it.
And that's all he wanted to say on his behalf.
And so he thought he didn't have to give his explanation. He didn't have to tell a why.
what's that? Okay. All right, so take him on back.
That's what makes me lose sleep at night, because I'll never know why. I'll never know why it happened. I'll never know.
There's likely several reasons why Paul ended up murdering Mandy. Paul wanted control from the very beginning, and he had it until the very end.
She was an amazing person.
Mandy would want to be remembered as the funny, goofy, outgoing, people-friendly person that she was. I like to think I'm gonna see her again. That's what keeps me going every day. We'll see our loved ones again.
November 20th, 2014. The city had already slipped into the quiet rhythm that belongs only to late autumn nights in New York. Thanksgiving was only days away. Apartment windows glowed above crowded streets where families were finishing dinners, children were falling asleep, and commuters hurried toward warm homes before the temperature dropped any further. It was the kind of ordinary evening that would disappear into memory without leaving a trace. Yet somewhere in Brooklyn, inside a public housing complex that thousands of people passed every day without a second thought, a single moment was moving silently toward history. It would last less than a second. One gunshot. No chase. No robbery. No armed confrontation. No warning. When the echoes faded, a 28-year-old father named Akai Gurley would be dying on a concrete stairwell, struck by a bullet fired by a rookie New York City police officer who had never intended to shoot anyone. For years afterward, investigators, lawyers, journalists, police trainers, politicians, and ordinary citizens would return to that same question over and over again. How could one careless movement change so many lives? The answer was never as simple as people wanted it to be. Some believed it was a tragic accident. Others saw criminal negligence. Many believed it revealed something much larger than the actions of a single officer. They saw a story about neglected public housing, dangerous police tactics, inadequate training, racial tension, and a justice system that struggled to convince anyone that it treated every case equally. Long before courtrooms filled with arguments and protesters crowded the streets carrying signs, there was only darkness. Not metaphorical darkness. Real darkness. The stairwells inside the Louis H. Pink houses had become infamous among residents. Burnt-out lights often remained unrepaired for days or even weeks. Complaints traveled through maintenance offices, yet many hallways remained hidden behind shadows that swallowed every face and every movement. People who lived there learned to navigate those staircases almost by instinct. Visitors hesitated. Police officers approached them with caution. Every landing could hide someone. Every opening door could produce a surprise. Every unexplained sound forced the imagination to race ahead of reality. Those stairwells would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case, not because they committed the crime themselves, but because they shaped every decision made during those final seconds. The bullet that killed Akai Gurley did not begin its journey with hatred. It began with fear. Fear mixed with tension. Tension mixed with poor judgment. Poor judgment mixed with an environment that had already been failing its residents long before anyone pulled a trigger. To understand that night, it is impossible to begin with the gunshot. The story begins years earlier. It begins with a city constantly searching for ways to control crime while balancing the enormous responsibility carried by every police officer who wears a badge. For decades, the New York City Police Department had relied on patrol strategies designed to discourage criminal activity inside public housing developments. Officers routinely entered apartment buildings, climbing staircases floor by floor in what became known as vertical patrols. The concept sounded straightforward. Walk through every hallway. Check every landing. Look for suspicious activity. Maintain a visible police presence. In theory, criminals would think twice before using isolated stairwells for drug deals, robberies, or hiding illegal weapons. In practice, those patrols often placed officers inside confined spaces with limited visibility and very little room to react. Every closed door became a question. Every sudden noise demanded a split-second decision. Every shadow could either conceal danger or hide nothing at all. The officers assigned to these patrols knew they were entering unpredictable environments. Residents, meanwhile, often viewed these patrols differently. Some appreciated the police presence. Others felt they were being treated as suspects simply because of where they lived. That tension lingered beneath the surface long before November 2014. The Louis H. Pink houses stood in East New York, Brooklyn, one of the largest public housing developments in the city. Massive brick buildings rose above wide sidewalks that carried generations of families through daily life. Children played basketball in nearby courts. Parents pushed strollers across cracked pavement. Neighbors greeted one another in elevators that frequently broke down. Grandparents watched life unfold from apartment windows that overlooked courtyards filled with both laughter and frustration. Like many public housing developments across America, the Pink houses represented two very different realities at the same time. For the people who lived there, it was home. For outsiders, it often became little more than another headline connected to crime statistics. Television reports rarely showed birthday parties. They rarely showed holiday dinners. They rarely showed children racing home from school or parents working multiple jobs to keep food on the table. Instead, cameras usually arrived after violence. That imbalance shaped public perception for decades. By the time Peter Liang walked into those buildings as a police officer, the location already carried a reputation that influenced expectations before anything happened. Every officer assigned there understood that reputation. Every resident lived with its consequences. Peter Liang himself represented another complicated story. Born to Chinese immigrant parents, he had chosen a profession defined by pressure and public scrutiny. Becoming a New York City police officer carried enormous responsibility even for veterans. Liang was not a veteran. He had graduated from the police academy only about 18 months earlier. Compared with experienced officers who had spent years responding to dangerous calls, Liang remained relatively new to the job. He was still learning, still adapting, still building confidence. Friends and colleagues described him as quiet rather than aggressive. Nothing in his background suggested he would one day become the center of one of the most controversial police shooting cases in modern New York history. He was simply another young officer trying to prove himself in one of the most demanding police departments in the world. His partner that evening, Officer Sean Landor, was similarly inexperienced. Together, they represented two young officers assigned to complete what was considered a routine patrol. Routine. It is a word that appears repeatedly in police reports. Routine traffic stop. Routine building check. Routine patrol. Yet policing has always carried an uncomfortable truth. There is no such thing as a completely routine encounter. Every ordinary assignment possesses the potential to become extraordinary within seconds. Most shifts end quietly. Some change lives forever. Across the city that same evening, another life followed an entirely different rhythm. Akai Gurley was not searching for trouble. He was not running from police. He was not carrying a weapon. Friends remembered him as gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply devoted to his young daughter. Like countless parents across New York, he spent much of his life trying to create stability for the people he loved. The approaching Thanksgiving holiday promised time with family. Time to slow down. Time to enjoy familiar traditions. That evening, Gurley planned something so ordinary that millions of Americans would recognize it instantly. He was visiting his girlfriend, Melissa Butler. There was nothing remarkable about the decision. No warning suggested the evening would become his last. No instinct told him to choose another building. No voice whispered that history waited inside a dark stairwell. Life rarely announces its turning points in advance. It disguises them as ordinary moments. A visit. A conversation. A walk downstairs. A door opening. By the time Akai Gurley entered the Louis H. Pink houses, another pair of footsteps had already begun climbing through the building from a different direction. Neither man knew the other existed. Neither imagined that within minutes their lives would collide in a way that neither family, nor the city of New York, would ever forget. Neither path was unusual on its own. Akai Gurley and Melissa Butler had spent the evening together as countless couples do, talking about everyday life while the holiday season slowly approached. Thanksgiving was less than a week away, and the city had already begun to wear the subtle signs of celebration. Grocery stores displayed stacks of canned goods and fresh produce. Families were making plans. Children looked forward to school vacations. The ordinary rhythm of life continued without interruption. Inside the pink houses, however, ordinary often existed alongside uncertainty. Residents had learned to adapt to problems that should never have become normal. Elevators sometimes failed without warning. Hallway lights flickered or disappeared into darkness for days. Maintenance requests accumulated while people adjusted their routines around broken systems that rarely seemed urgent to anyone outside the buildings themselves. For many residents, walking through the stairwells after sunset required instinct more than sight. People counted steps from memory. They kept one hand against the wall. They listened more carefully than they looked. Darkness became part of the architecture. To someone unfamiliar with the building, those stairwells felt almost claustrophobic. The concrete walls trapped every sound. Footsteps echoed in confusing directions. A door opening several floors away could seem only a few feet distant. Shadows erased depth, making distances difficult to judge. It was an environment where uncertainty became constant. For police officers conducting vertical patrols, that uncertainty was magnified. The assignment demanded alertness from beginning to end. Officers entered unfamiliar buildings where visibility could disappear within seconds. Every landing required attention. Every closed door forced them to imagine possibilities they could not see. Training emphasized caution. Experience, however, could not be taught overnight. Experience came only after years of responding to unexpected situations, learning when instinct was reliable and when fear distorted perception. Peter Liang had not yet accumulated those years. He was still discovering what it meant to carry a loaded service weapon through environments that changed from one floor to the next. There was another truth that would later become central to the public conversation. Police officers are trained to make decisions in fractions of a second. The legal system, by contrast, examines those same decisions over months and years. Jurors replay evidence frame by frame. Experts measure distances. Attorneys question every movement. The difference between those two perspectives would become impossible to ignore after November 20, 2014. Before that happened, though, everything still belonged to the quiet routine of another patrol shift. Liang and his partner continued moving through the building, checking floor after floor. Elsewhere in the same building, Kai Gurley and Melissa Butler prepared to leave. There was no urgency. No argument. No emergency. Only the familiar decision to head downstairs together. Had one couple delayed their departure by a minute, the story might have ended differently. Had one patrol begun on another floor, history might never have remembered either name. Those possibilities would haunt countless discussions afterward. But history is not written from possibilities. It is written from moments that cannot be taken back. Outside, Brooklyn carried on as though nothing extraordinary was about to happen. Cars rolled through intersections beneath changing traffic lights. Subway trains rattled beneath the streets. A few pedestrians hurried against the cold wind, collars pulled high around their necks. Apartment windows reflected warm yellow light into the darkness. Somewhere, televisions broadcast late-night news. Somewhere else, parents tucked children into bed. No one outside the pink houses knew that within minutes, one of the city's most controversial police shootings would unfold inside a stairwell that many New Yorkers had never even heard of. The tragedy that followed would not fit neatly into the familiar categories that often define criminal cases. There would be no allegation that Kai Gurley threatened the officers. No evidence that he reached for a weapon. No claim that he ignored police commands. He was simply there. Equally important, investigators would never conclude that Peter Liang deliberately set out to kill an innocent man. That uncomfortable reality divided public opinion almost immediately. If there was no intent, what was justice supposed to look like? If the shooting was accidental, could criminal responsibility still exist? If police officers are trusted with deadly force, should a fatal mistake be judged differently from an ordinary citizen's mistake? Those questions would dominate headlines, public demonstrations, television debates, and courtroom arguments for years. Yet in the beginning, none of those debates existed. There were only human beings moving through the same building without realizing how close they had come to one another. One carried groceries earlier that week. Another carried a department-issued Glock pistol. One thought about family. The other thought about completing another patrol. Neither expected to become a national symbol. The pink houses themselves almost seemed indifferent to the lives passing through them. the aging concrete walls had witnessed thousands of arguments, celebrations, disappointments, and ordinary conversations over the decades. Countless footsteps had echoed through those same stairwells. Most disappeared into memory. One would not. Later investigations would reconstruct the building almost like a puzzle. Investigators measured hallways. They documented lighting conditions. They studied the angle of the bullet's path. Experts analyzed how a single round could strike a concrete surface before changing direction. Lawyers transformed architectural details into courtroom exhibits. Every crack in the timeline became significant. Every second mattered. But before evidence boards and legal arguments came something much simpler. Silence. The kind of silence that settles over apartment buildings late at night, interrupted only by distant footsteps or the metallic sound of a heavy fire door closing somewhere above. It was into that silence that two separate stories continued moving. Akai Gurley had spent 28 years building a life defined not by headlines but by relationships. Those closest to him remembered kindness more readily than conflict. He was a father before he was a victim. A son before he became a name repeated by television anchors. A friend before strangers debated his death through political arguments and social media posts. That distinction matters because true crime stories often begin with death. Real lives begin much earlier. The same was true for Peter Liang. Before photographs of him appeared across newspaper front pages, he had been another young officer navigating the enormous expectations placed upon members of the NYPD. He represented the ambitions of immigrant parents who believed public service offered dignity and stability. He wore the uniform believing he could contribute to the city he called home. Neither man's life could be understood through a single night alone. And yet that single night would redefine both forever. By sunrise, one family would begin planning a funeral. Another would begin preparing for investigations that would eventually become criminal charges. Communities that had rarely spoken to one another would suddenly find themselves standing on opposite sides of emotionally charged debates. Questions about race, policing, accountability, public housing, and justice would become inseparable from one fatal bullet. But all of that still lay ahead. At that moment, the future remained invisible. The stairwell remained dark. The officers continued their patrol. Akai Gurley and Melissa Butler continued toward the stairs. The distance separating them was shrinking with every passing second. No witness could stop what was coming. No warning could arrive in time. The city outside continued breathing, unaware that an ordinary November evening was about to become one of the most examined moments in modern New York policing. In less than a heartbeat, one movement would set events into motion that could never be reversed, transforming an unnoticed stairwell into the center of a national conversation and leaving two families to live with consequences neither had imagined when the night began. The official records would later reduce the beginning of the incident to a handful of entries. Date, time, location, names. Those few lines of text were accurate, but they failed to capture the atmosphere that surrounded the people involved before everything changed. They could not describe the weight of the darkness inside the building, the uncertainty that accompanied every step through the stairwell, or the ordinary expectations each person carried into that night. To understand why this case continues to be studied more than a decade later, it is necessary to leave the courtroom behind for a moment and return to East New York as it existed in late 2014. Brooklyn has always been a borough of contrasts. Luxury apartments and struggling neighborhoods exist only a few miles apart, separated less by geography than by opportunity. East New York, despite generations of resilient families determined to build better lives, had long struggled with poverty, underinvestment, and crime. Public housing developments became symbols of both community and neglect. The Louis H. Pink houses stood among those symbols. Completed decades earlier as part of New York City's public housing system, the complex was designed to provide affordable homes for working families. Thousands of people built their lives there. Children learned to ride bicycles in the courtyards. Teenagers played basketball until the streetlights came on. Elderly residents greeted neighbors from benches during the summer months. Birthday parties, family reunions, graduations, and holiday dinners filled apartments year after year. For the people who lived there, the pink houses were never simply buildings. They were home. Yet the physical condition of many parts of the complex told another story. Years of deferred maintenance had left visible scars throughout the property. Paint peeled from walls. Elevators occasionally failed. Residents repeatedly reported broken lighting in hallways and stairwells. Those complaints often lingered unresolved, leaving entire sections of the buildings cloaked in darkness after sunset. That darkness became more than an inconvenience. It became a daily risk. Parents worried when their children returned home after evening activities. Older residents moved carefully, afraid of falling down poorly lit stairs. Visitors unfamiliar with the buildings often hesitated before entering. Police officers viewed those same conditions through another lens. Limited visibility increased uncertainty. Uncertainty increased tension. And tension could change decisions in ways that were impossible to predict until something went wrong. By late 2014, the New York City Police Department continued relying on what officers called vertical patrols. The strategy was straightforward in theory. Officers entered residential buildings and systematically checked stairwells, hallways, rooftops, and common areas where illegal activity sometimes occurred. The patrols served several purposes. They discouraged trespassing. They disrupted drug activity. They increased police visibility. At least, that was the objective. Supporters argued the strategy helped reduce crime. Critics believed it created unnecessary confrontations between officers and residents who were simply trying to go about their daily lives. Both perspectives contained elements of truth. The officers assigned to these patrols understood that danger could emerge without warning. Unlike responding to a 911 call, where dispatchers often provided at least some information, vertical patrols required officers to enter environments filled with unknowns. Every closed stairwell door concealed uncertainty. Every unexplained noise demanded attention. Every shadow forced officers to distinguish between imagination and reality. Training attempted to prepare them for those situations, but no academy could recreate the emotional pressure of walking through a pitch-black stairwell where visibility extended only a few feet. Peter Liang knew those realities. At 27 years old, he was still relatively new to policing. He had joined the NYPD in 2013 after graduating from the police academy, entering a profession where mistakes could carry life-changing consequences. Like many rookie officers, Liang wanted to perform well. He wanted to earn respect. He wanted to prove he belonged. Veteran officers often develop instincts refined through years of experience, learning when to slow down, when to speak calmly, and when to anticipate danger before it fully develops. Those instincts are rarely innate. They are earned. Liang was still earning his. His assignment that evening paired him with Officer Sean Landor, another young patrol officer. Neither man could have predicted that their routine patrol would eventually become part of police training discussions, legal textbooks, and public policy debates across the United States. As their shift progressed, nothing suggested they were approaching a defining moment. Police work is filled with hours of repetition. Checking doors. Walking hallways. Watching intersections. Completing paperwork. Most shifts end without incident. The danger lies in never knowing which ordinary moment will suddenly become extraordinary. Across the city, Kai Gurley was living an entirely different version of the same evening. Friends remembered him as someone whose identity centered on family rather than conflict. He loved spending time with his young daughter and remained deeply connected to those closest to him. People who knew him described a man whose quiet personality rarely attracted attention. He was not famous. He was not politically active. He was not involved in any event likely to place him in front of television cameras. His life unfolded much like thousands of others across New York. Work. Family. Friends. Plans for the future. On the evening of November 20th, Gurley visited his girlfriend, Melissa Butler, inside the Pink Houses. Thanksgiving was approaching, and the visit reflected the normal routines shared by countless couples preparing for family gatherings. Nothing about that decision seemed remarkable. No one could have imagined that choosing one stairwell over another would determine the course of history. It is often tempting to search for dramatic warning signs before tragedy. Real life rarely offers them. Most catastrophic events begin quietly. A familiar building. A routine patrol. A visit between loved ones. Ordinary choices unfolding at the same moment. As midnight approached, temperatures continued to fall outside. Cold air drifted through gaps around entrance doors each time someone entered or exited the building. Inside, the concrete stairwells trapped the chill, creating an environment that felt isolated from the warmth of nearby apartments. The silence inside those staircases carried its own personality. Footsteps echoed upward and downward at the same time. Voices became distorted by concrete walls. Metal doors slammed with startling force, sending sharp sounds through multiple floors. Without adequate lighting, hearing often became more important than sight. Residents understood those sounds instinctively. Officers listened to them differently. Every unexpected noise demanded evaluation. Every movement required interpretation. Sometimes the explanation was harmless. Sometimes it was not. The challenge lay in distinguishing between the two before making irreversible decisions. That challenge formed the invisible backdrop of everything that followed. Neither Akai Gurley nor Peter Liang entered the building intending to become part of a national story. One arrived to spend time with someone he loved. The other arrived to complete another assignment before the end of his shift. Their worlds remained completely separate. For now. The distance between them measured only a few flights of stairs, but emotionally they occupied entirely different realities, unaware that their lives were moving toward the same point in space. History often focuses on the instant when everything changes. Equally important are the quiet minutes beforehand, when every outcome still seems possible. Those minutes belong to ordinary life. The ordinary life that would soon disappear forever. As the night deepened, the Louis H. Pink Houses settled into the familiar rhythm that every large apartment complex develops after dark. Behind hundreds of doors, life continued in quiet, ordinary ways. Televisions flickered inside living rooms where families relaxed after long workdays. The smell of late dinners still lingered in some apartments. Somewhere, a baby cried before being comforted back to sleep. A teenager laughed at something on a cell phone. An elderly resident slowly locked an apartment door before preparing for bed. None of those people knew they were sharing the building with a moment that would soon become part of New York City's history. The contrast was striking. Inside individual apartments, there was warmth, conversation, and routine. Outside those apartments, the stairwells felt cold and abandoned. The difference was not only physical. It was psychological. Residents often described the staircases as places they moved through rather than places they occupied. Few people lingered there longer than necessary. The dim lighting, aging concrete, and hollow echoes created an atmosphere that encouraged everyone to keep walking. For police officers, however, the stairwell was not something to pass through quickly. It was the assignment itself. Every landing had to be checked. Every floor required attention. Every blind corner had to be approached carefully. The concept of vertical patrol had developed from years of policing experience in public housing developments. Officers were expected to make their presence visible, discouraging criminal activity simply by being there. The strategy had produced successes in some cases, but it also placed officers inside confined spaces where split-second judgments carried extraordinary consequences. Unlike an open street, a stairwell offered few options. There was little room to retreat. Visibility changed instantly from one floor to the next. Heavy fire doors blocked both sound and sight until the moment they swung open. Every new landing presented an entirely new environment. For experienced officers, those conditions demanded discipline above all else. Firearms were tools of last resort, not instruments to compensate for uncertainty. That principle would later become central to every legal argument surrounding Peter Liang's actions. Investigators would conclude that his service weapon did not discharge on its own. The Glock required deliberate pressure on the trigger before it could fire. The weapon functioned exactly as it had been designed to function. The critical question, therefore, was not whether the firearm malfunctioned, but why the trigger had been pulled in the first place. That question would follow Peter Liang for years. But on the evening of November 20th, it had not yet been asked. At that moment, Liang remained focused on completing what appeared to be another routine patrol. Like many young officers, he had entered policing understanding that danger was always a possibility. Every academy graduate is taught that complacency can be fatal. Stories of officers ambushed during seemingly ordinary assignments become part of police culture, reinforcing the belief that constant vigilance is essential. That mindset serves an important purpose. It keeps officers alert. Yet heightened alertness carries its own risks. Fear sharpens the senses, but it can also narrow judgment. The human brain, when confronted with uncertainty, often fills empty spaces with imagined threats. In darkness, ordinary sounds seem louder. Sudden movements appear more alarming. Split-second decisions become influenced not only by what a person sees, but by what they fear might be there. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the body's survival response. Under stress, perception changes. Time appears to slow. The mind searches desperately for patterns that might signal danger. Most of the time, those instincts help people survive. Occasionally, they produce catastrophic mistakes. The investigation into Akai Gurley's death would eventually explore those psychological realities in detail, but no scientific explanation could lessen the human cost of what happened. Elsewhere inside the building, Akai Gurley had no reason to think about police tactics or officer psychology. His evening had unfolded without conflict. He was spending time with Melissa Butler, someone who had become an important part of his life. Their plans were ordinary, grounded in the simple routines that define most relationships. Thanksgiving was approaching, and like many families across America, they were thinking about the days ahead rather than fearing the next few minutes. It is impossible to overstate how ordinary that decision was. Millions of people visit loved ones every evening. Millions walk down apartment staircases without giving the journey a second thought. For Akai Gurley, this was simply another walk. Nothing more. Nothing less. Later, investigators would reconstruct the timeline with remarkable precision. They would compare surveillance footage, radio transmissions, witness statements, and forensic evidence. They would estimate where each person stood at different moments. Distances would be measured in feet. Time would be calculated in seconds. The reconstruction created a detailed sequence of events. It could explain where people moved. It could explain when they moved. But it could never explain the one thing everyone wished they could change. Why? Why did a routine patrol intersect with an innocent man's path at precisely that moment? Why had the broken lights remained unrepaired? Why was a firearm already drawn before any threat had been identified? Why did a single bullet alter so many lives? Those questions would echo far beyond Brooklyn. Civil rights organizations would ask them. Police unions would ask them. Journalists would ask them. Jurors would ask them. Families on both sides would spend years living with them. The answers, however, would never satisfy everyone. That is one reason this case continues to occupy such a unique place in discussions about policing in America. It defies simple narratives. There was no evidence that Akai Gurley provoked the encounter. There was no evidence that Peter Liang intended to kill a stranger. Instead, the tragedy emerged from a combination of human decision-making, environmental failure, and institutional practices that collided within seconds. One factor alone cannot explain the outcome. Taken together, they created a chain of events that proved impossible to reverse. Outside the pink houses, New York continued moving through another ordinary November night. Taxicabs crossed the Brooklyn Bridge. Restaurants served their final customers before closing. Hospital emergency rooms admitted new patients. Police officers in other precincts answered unrelated calls, unaware that one incident in East New York would soon dominate headlines across the country. Inside the building, the distance between two lives continued to shrink. One pair of footsteps descended. Another pair moved through the upper floors. Concrete walls separated them. Darkness concealed them from one another. Neither side could see what lay just beyond the next fire door. Neither side understood how little time remained before everything changed. In hindsight, the story seems almost unbearably fragile. A functioning light bulb. A different patrol route. Another choice of staircase. A brief delay before leaving the apartment. Any one of those changes might have rewritten history. But history offers no opportunity for revision. It records only what happened. And on that cold November night, inside one of Brooklyn's largest public housing developments, every ordinary decision was quietly guiding two strangers toward a single irreversible moment. The next few seconds would transform a routine patrol into a national controversy, leave a young daughter without her father, place a rookie police officer at the center of one of the most scrutinized criminal prosecutions involving the NYPD in modern history, and force an entire city to confront difficult questions about responsibility, training, fear, and the true cost of a single pull of a trigger. Before his name became associated with headlines, courtroom testimony, and public demonstrations, Kai Gurley was simply a man trying to build a better future. That is often the first truth lost in cases that capture national attention. The victim slowly becomes a symbol. A photograph appears on television. A name is repeated by reporters. Statistics replace memories. Legal arguments replace stories. Eventually, people begin debating what happened without ever learning who the person was before tragedy interrupted his life. Kai Gurley deserved more than that. He deserved to be remembered not as a case number or a political talking point, but as a son, a father, a partner, and a friend whose life was still unfolding. Those closest to him rarely described him through extraordinary achievements. Instead, they remembered ordinary moments. The quiet conversations. The easy smile. The way he made time for people he cared about. The concern he showed for his family. Those details may appear small, but together they reveal something far more important than any headline ever could. They reveal a human being. Born in 1986, Kai Gurley grew up in New York during a period when many neighborhoods were changing rapidly. Opportunities existed, but so did challenges. Like countless young men raised in working-class communities, he experienced a world where success often depended on persistence as much as talent. Life was rarely simple. Money could be tight. Jobs came and went. Responsibilities arrived early. Yet the people who knew him remembered someone who continued moving forward, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. He was not famous. He did not seek attention. His ambitions were personal rather than public. The most important title he ever carried was not employee, resident, or citizen. It was father. Friends would later speak about the pride that appeared on his face whenever conversations turned toward his daughter. Parenthood had given him something larger than himself to protect. Like millions of fathers across America, he measured success not by recognition but by whether he could create a safer, more stable future for the child who depended on him. Children have a remarkable way of changing ordinary routines into meaningful rituals. A simple phone call becomes important. A visit becomes something to anticipate. Plans for the future suddenly stretch years ahead instead of days. Those who become parents often begin imagining graduations they have not yet attended, birthdays that remain years away, and conversations that exist only in hope. Kai was no different. His daughter represented possibility. She represented tomorrow. No one could have imagined that tomorrow would arrive without him. Family members later described him as gentle by nature. He was not someone who searched for confrontation. People trusted him because he listened more than he spoke. In groups, he rarely demanded attention. He possessed the kind of quiet personality that sometimes disappears in a world fascinated by louder voices. Quiet people are often misunderstood. Their stories receive less attention because they unfold without drama. But kindness leaves its own lasting impressions. Friends remembered the reliability that cannot be measured by awards or newspaper articles. If someone needed help moving furniture, Kai showed up. If family gathered for birthdays or holidays, he was there. If someone called needing support, he answered. These moments never became public until after his death. Ironically, tragedy introduced the world to qualities that had always defined him. Like many New Yorkers, Kai balanced dreams with practical realities. Life demanded work, responsibility, and resilience. Every paycheck mattered. Every decision carried consequences for the people who depended on him. There was nothing glamorous about that life. There did not need to be. The dignity of ordinary people often lies in their willingness to continue despite uncertainty. Wake up. Go to work. Care for family. Repeat tomorrow. It is a rhythm shared by millions. Akai's life followed that rhythm. His relationship with Melissa Butler became another important part of that routine. Those who knew them described a couple building a future together one ordinary day at a time. There were no extravagant stories, no celebrity lifestyles, no dramatic headlines. There was simply life. Conversations over meals. Plans for holidays. Small disagreements quickly forgotten. Shared laughter after difficult days. The ordinary intimacy that grows only through time. Those quiet moments would later become priceless memories. On the evening of November 20, 2014, nothing suggested their time together was approaching its end. Thanksgiving was only days away. Across New York, families were discussing recipes, grocery shopping, and travel arrangements. The holiday carried familiar traditions that repeated themselves year after year. Relatives planned reunions. Children counted the days until school vacations. Kitchens prepared for gatherings that would fill homes with conversation and warmth. Akai expected to be part of those celebrations. His future still contained birthdays he intended to attend. Holidays he planned to enjoy. Moments with his daughter that he believed were still waiting ahead. Like everyone else, he assumed tomorrow would arrive. That assumption is one of life's quiet promises. Most people leave home believing they will return. They kiss loved ones goodbye without imagining it could be the last time. They postpone conversations because another opportunity will surely come. Only afterward do ordinary moments reveal how extraordinary they truly were. There is no evidence that Akai felt anxious that evening. No indication that he sensed danger. He was not avoiding anyone. He was not involved in a confrontation. He was not attempting to escape from police. He was simply living his life. That fact would become one of the defining elements of the case. When investigators reconstructed the events, they found no behavior suggesting Akai had done anything to provoke the fatal encounter. He was unarmed. He had committed no violent act. He posed no identified threat to the officers conducting their patrol. These facts remained largely uncontested throughout the legal proceedings. Yet knowing those facts today makes the story no less painful. If anything, it deepens the tragedy. Because every detail reinforces how unexpectedly his life ended. Imagine the final ordinary conversations that evening. Perhaps they discussed Thanksgiving. Perhaps they laughed about something insignificant. Perhaps they planned what to do the following weekend. No recording exists. Those words disappeared with time. Like so many final conversations between loved ones, they were never preserved because no one imagined they needed to be. Only after tragedy do people desperately try to remember every sentence, every smile, every goodbye. Melissa Butler would later become one of the most important witnesses in the case, but before she became a witness, she was simply a woman spending time with someone she loved. That distinction matters. Court testimony often strips emotion from memory. Questions become clinical. Answers become evidence. But before lawyers entered the story, there were only two people sharing an ordinary evening together inside an apartment building that thousands of residents called home. Nothing about Akai Gurley's life suggested he was destined to become part of a national debate. He did not seek the spotlight. History found him anyway. And in doing so, it forever changed the lives of everyone who loved him. As news of Akai Gurley's death spread in the hours and days that followed, the public learned his name almost immediately. Television broadcasts showed his photograph. Newspapers summarized his life in a few paragraphs. Reporters interviewed grieving relatives standing outside apartment buildings and courthouse entrances. But grief has a way of resisting summary. A life cannot be measured by a newspaper column. It cannot be reduced to the date of birth, the date of death, and the circumstances that connect the two. For Akai's family, the loss was not an abstract discussion about policing or public policy. It was painfully personal. A chair at future family dinners would remain empty. Phone calls would never again be answered. Holiday traditions would continue, but someone essential would always be missing. His daughter was too young to fully understand the legal arguments that would dominate the coming years. She would not recognize the meaning of grand jury indictments, forensic testimony, or criminal negligence. She would understand something much simpler. Her father was gone. That absence would shape birthdays, school events, graduations, and countless ordinary moments that children instinctively expect to share with a parent. Those are the hidden consequences of violent death. Court sentences have an ending. Grief rarely does. Friends remembered Akai as someone who rarely made life about himself. He found comfort in familiar routines and familiar people. There was no public image to maintain, no audience to impress. His world revolved around relationships that existed long before cameras arrived and would continue long after television crews packed away their equipment. One friend later described the disbelief that settled over everyone who knew him. The details seemed impossible to accept. They searched for explanations that might somehow make sense of the tragedy, but every answer only created another question. How could someone leave home for an ordinary evening and never come back? How could a building he had entered countless times suddenly become the place where his life ended? Those questions echoed through every conversation after the shooting. Melissa Butler carried memories no one should ever have to possess. She had expected nothing more than to leave the apartment with the man she loved. Instead, within moments, she found herself desperately trying to save his life. The ordinary future they had imagined together disappeared almost instantly, replaced by chaos, fear, and helplessness. Trauma has a cruel relationship with memory. Some moments become blurred. Others remain permanently sharp. People who survive traumatic events often remember insignificant details with extraordinary clarity. The texture of a wall. The temperature of the air. The expression on someone's face. A single sentence repeated endlessly in their thoughts. Those fragments remain long after the event itself has passed. For Melissa, the stairwell would never again be just another staircase. It became the place where life divided into two chapters. Everything before. Everything after. Akai's family soon faced another painful reality that many families of homicide victims eventually encounter. Their private mourning became public. Reporters requested interviews. Television cameras waited outside court hearings. Strangers debated the case on social media. Politicians referenced his death during speeches. Civil rights organizations carried his photograph during demonstrations. His name gradually became larger than the man himself. To some people, Akai Gurley became a symbol of police accountability. To others, he represented broader concerns about public housing and neglected communities. Still others viewed the case primarily through questions of race or criminal justice. Each perspective reflected part of a larger conversation. Yet none of them could fully capture the individual whose life had been interrupted. Behind every public symbol remains a private family. That family continues living long after headlines disappear. His loved ones would later describe the quiet moments that hurt the most. Not the crowded press conferences. Not the courthouse steps. But the ordinary mornings when someone instinctively reached for the phone before remembering there would be no answer. The family gatherings where everyone unconsciously expected him to walk through the door. The birthdays where one voice was missing from the celebration. Those moments rarely appear in legal documents. They are no less real. As investigators examined forensic evidence and attorneys prepared legal strategies, Akai's family measured time differently. Not by court dates. By loss. The first Thanksgiving without him arrived only days after the shooting. A holiday built around togetherness became an overwhelming reminder of absence. The meal was still prepared. Relatives still gathered. But every empty place setting carried a meaning that no one had anticipated only a week earlier. Then came Christmas. Then New Year's Day. Then his daughter's next birthday. Life continued because it had to. Grief traveled alongside it. In the months ahead, the nation would become deeply divided over how Peter Liang should be judged. Some argued that he deserved criminal punishment for violating fundamental firearm safety principles. Others believed he had made a tragic mistake that should not result in imprisonment. Those debates were intense. Sometimes emotional. Occasionally angry. For Akai Gurley's family, however, one fact remained unchanged regardless of anyone's opinion. No verdict could restore what had been taken. Justice, whatever form it eventually assumed, could never recreate a father's embrace. No legal ruling could replace years that would never be lived. No sentence could allow his daughter to grow up with the man she had lost. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson hidden within this case. When a life ends suddenly, every future possibility ends with it. The conversations that never happen. The holidays never shared. The advice never given. The grandchildren never held. The countless ordinary moments that seem insignificant until they become impossible. Before November 20, 2014, Akai Gurley had been looking toward tomorrow with the quiet confidence shared by millions of people living ordinary lives. After November 20th, tomorrow belonged only to those left behind. As his family struggled to comprehend their new reality, investigators were already beginning the painstaking process of determining exactly what had happened inside the dark stairwell of the Louis H. Pink houses. Measurements would be taken. Witnesses interviewed. Ballistics examined. Every second reconstructed. Those findings would eventually shape one of the most closely watched criminal prosecutions involving an NYPD officer in modern history. But before there were indictments, courtroom testimony, or public demonstrations, there remained one unanswered question that overshadowed every other. How had an ordinary evening between two people become a fatal encounter that neither of them had seen coming? The answer lay inside a stairwell where darkness, human judgment, and a single irreversible decision were about to collide. At approximately 11:15 p.m., two separate journeys entered the same building. Neither side knew the other was there. Peter Liang and his partner, Officer Sean Landor, arrived at the Louis H. Pink houses to perform what was officially considered a routine vertical patrol. Their assignment was neither unusual nor unexpected. Officers throughout New York City carried out similar patrols every day, climbing through apartment buildings, checking stairwells, and looking for signs of criminal activity before moving on to the next location. The paperwork would later describe it in only a few words. Routine patrol. Nothing about those words hinted at what was about to happen. Liang and Landor entered the building wearing the standard equipment carried by NYPD patrol officers. Radios remained clipped to their uniforms. Their duty belts held handcuffs, flashlights, and fully loaded service weapons. Like every officer beginning a patrol, they had no way of knowing whether the next 30 minutes would pass uneventfully or become the defining moment of their careers. The building itself offered no warning. From the outside, it looked much like the surrounding apartment towers that filled the housing complex. Hundreds of residents lived behind its brick walls, each apartment containing its own stories, routines, and worries. Inside, however, the atmosphere changed immediately. The stairwell swallowed light. Residents had complained for days about broken lighting throughout sections of the building. Those complaints had not yet resulted in repairs. Large portions of the staircase remained almost completely dark, forcing anyone who entered to rely on instinct as much as vision. Concrete walls absorbed the little light that managed to enter from distant hallways. Each landing disappeared into shadow. The metal fire doors separated one floor from another like barriers between isolated worlds. Even familiar buildings become unsettling when darkness removes visual certainty. For officers, uncertainty demands attention. For residents, uncertainty becomes exhausting. Liang and Landor began climbing upward, following the procedures they had practiced countless times during training. Vertical patrol required patience. Officers moved methodically from floor to floor, checking landings, scanning corners, listening for unusual sounds, and remaining alert to potential threats that might emerge without warning. Their footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete. Each heavy door closed behind them with a metallic crash that reverberated through the building. Somewhere below, residents continued their evenings without paying attention to those sounds. Police patrols were not uncommon inside the pink houses. Most passed without incident. On another floor, Kai Gurley and Melissa Butler prepared to leave the apartment where they had spent the evening together. Their decision carried no urgency. They were simply heading downstairs. There was no argument. No emergency. No attempt to avoid anyone. Just the ordinary act of leaving a building. It is impossible to know exactly what they discussed during those final minutes together. Perhaps they talked about Thanksgiving plans. Perhaps they laughed about something insignificant that would have been forgotten by morning. Perhaps they walked in comfortable silence. Like countless ordinary conversations, those moments were never recorded because no one imagined they would become the last. Melissa later recalled that they chose to use the stairwell rather than wait for the elevator. It was a decision made by residents every day. Nothing more. At nearly the same time, Peter Liang and Sean Landor continued progressing through the upper floors of the building. As they approached the 8th floor, visibility grew even worse. The darkness was no longer merely inconvenient. It was overwhelming. Investigators would later examine photographs taken inside the stairwell under similar conditions. The images revealed a space where facial features became difficult to distinguish and distances nearly impossible to judge without artificial light. Under those circumstances, proper police procedure became especially important. Training emphasized identifying potential threats before pointing or firing a weapon. Flashlights existed precisely because darkness should not automatically justify drawing a firearm. Yet what happened next would become one of the central issues examined during both the criminal investigation and the trial. According to evidence presented in court, Peter Liang already had his Glock 9mm pistol in his left hand. His flashlight remained in his right. That detail appears simple at first glance. In reality, it became enormously significant. Investigators later argued that drawing the weapon before identifying any immediate threat violated fundamental firearm safety principles taught within the department. The defense maintained that Liang feared unexpected danger inside the dark stairwell and reacted to conditions he believed were potentially hazardous. Those competing interpretations would dominate courtroom testimony. At that moment, however, there were no lawyers. Only two officers moving through darkness. Liang reached the door leading into the stairwell on the 8th floor. Beyond the door lay another landing hidden almost entirely from view. He could not see what waited below. He could hear only the distorted echoes common inside enclosed concrete staircases. The silence felt deceptive. Every experienced officer understands that darkness has a way of amplifying uncertainty. A shifting shadow appears larger than it is. A sudden noise seems closer than reality. The imagination races ahead of the evidence. Whether Peter Liang consciously experienced those thoughts during that instant remains impossible to know. Only he truly knew what passed through his mind. What is known comes from forensic evidence. As Liang pushed open the heavy metal door, something caused him to react. He later stated that he heard a noise and became startled. Exactly what produced that sound has never been established with certainty. Perhaps it was footsteps. Perhaps it was the movement of another door. Perhaps it was simply the ordinary echo of people using the stairwell below. Whatever the source, the reaction occurred almost instantly. The next movement lasted less than a second. His finger tightened on the trigger. The Glock fired. The explosion shattered the silence that had filled the stairwell only moments earlier. A bright muzzle flash briefly illuminated the darkness before disappearing just as quickly. One bullet left the barrel at tremendous speed. Once fired, there was no recalling it. No correcting its path. No second chance. The round struck a concrete wall inside the stairwell. Instead of stopping, it ricocheted. Its direction changed violently. The bullet continued downward into an area Peter Liang could not see. Below him, Kai Gurley and Melissa Butler had only an instant to react. They had not seen an officer. They had received no warning. There had been no shouted command. Only the deafening sound of a gunshot echoing through the darkness. In less than a heartbeat, the bullet reached Kai Gurley. It entered his chest with devastating force. The ordinary evening that had begun with simple plans for Thanksgiving ended in a single irreversible moment. Everything that followed, the investigations, the protests, the courtroom battles, and the national debate, would trace its origins back to that fraction of a second inside a stairwell where one pull of a trigger forever altered the lives of two families and changed the course of one rookie police officer's future. For a fraction of a second after the gunshot, the building seemed suspended between silence and chaos. The sound crashed through the concrete stairwell, ricocheting from wall to wall before fading into an eerie stillness. In enclosed spaces, a gunshot does not simply end when the trigger is pulled. It lingers. It rolls through every landing, slipping beneath apartment doors and into hallways where startled residents froze, unsure whether they had heard fireworks, construction, or something far more dangerous. Inside the stairwell, however, there was no uncertainty. Something terrible had happened. Peter Liang stood on the upper landing, still holding his Glock in one hand and his flashlight in the other. The burst of adrenaline that accompanies an unexpected discharge often leaves even trained officers momentarily disoriented. Later testimony would describe confusion, disbelief, and shock, but at that instant, there was no courtroom language to explain what was unfolding. There was only the realization that a weapon had fired. Whether Liang immediately understood that someone had been struck remains a matter of interpretation, but everyone agrees that the shot itself had been entirely unexpected. Below, Kai Gurley instinctively reacted before fully understanding what had happened. The human body often continues moving even after suffering catastrophic injury. Adrenaline masks pain, allowing people to remain on their feet for precious seconds before the full extent of the damage becomes impossible to ignore. Kai took several more steps. Melissa Butler later recalled that everything happened so quickly her mind struggled to process it. One moment they were simply walking down the stairs together. The next, Kai's body began to fail him. He did not cry out in anger. He did not understand why he had been shot. He had never seen the officer who fired the weapon. Instead, confusion overtook the moment. He staggered. His breathing changed almost immediately. Each movement became heavier than the last. Blood began spreading beneath his clothing, hidden at first by the darkness that had already concealed the people inside the stairwell from one another. Within seconds, his strength disappeared. His legs gave way. He collapsed onto the cold concrete landing. Melissa rushed toward him, desperately trying to understand what she was seeing. In darkness, injuries are often difficult to identify immediately. She knew something was terribly wrong, but the silence that followed the gunshot made the scene almost surreal. There had been no confrontation. No argument. No warning. Only a man who moments earlier had been walking beside her now lay struggling for life. She called his name. Again. And again. Panic replaced confusion. The stairwell that had seemed merely inconvenient minutes earlier suddenly became an impossible place to seek help. Concrete walls trapped every desperate cry while the darkness made it difficult to see the seriousness of his wounds. As Melissa tried to help Akai, events unfolded simultaneously on the upper landing. Peter Liang and Sean Landor now understood that someone below had been hit. The reality transformed what moments earlier had been a routine patrol into a life-or-death emergency. Every second suddenly mattered. Prosecutors would later argue that those first moments after the shooting revealed another critical failure. According to evidence presented during the trial, Liang did not immediately begin rendering aid to the wounded man. Instead, confusion dominated the officer's response. Testimony indicated there was uncertainty over who should notify supervisors and how to report what had just occurred. The prosecution contended that valuable time was lost. The defense responded that both officers had entered an overwhelming situation unlike anything they had previously experienced and were attempting to understand the rapidly unfolding emergency. Regardless of how those actions were later interpreted, one fact remained beyond dispute. Akai Gurley was critically wounded. Nothing happening above him could change that reality unless medical assistance arrived quickly. Melissa Butler refused to leave his side. She screamed for help with a desperation that carried through the building more powerfully than the gunshot itself. Apartment doors began opening. Curious neighbors became frightened witnesses as they stepped into hallways, trying to determine the source of the commotion. Residents who had spent years navigating broken elevators, dark stairwells, and neglected maintenance suddenly found themselves confronting an unimaginable scene inside the building they called home. Some rushed toward the cries. Others called emergency services. Several attempted to help despite having little or no medical training. In moments of crisis, strangers often become first responders long before ambulances arrive. That instinct appeared throughout the building. People who had never met Akai Gurley nevertheless recognized another human being in desperate need. They knelt beside him. They tried to comfort Melissa. Some attempted cardiopulmonary resuscitation while others searched for anything that might improve his chances of survival. Time, however, is unforgiving in cases involving gunshot wounds to the chest. Every heartbeat carried both hope and danger. Every passing minute reduced the likelihood of recovery. Later, prosecutors highlighted statements attributed to Peter Liang during those chaotic moments, saying he repeatedly expressed fear that he would lose his job. Those words would become emotionally powerful during the trial because they appeared to reveal where his thoughts had gone immediately after the shooting. The defense urged jurors to consider those statements within the context of overwhelming shock. A young officer had unintentionally discharged his firearm. A man had been gravely injured. His entire career, and perhaps his freedom, had suddenly collapsed before his eyes. Human beings experiencing profound trauma do not always react with clarity. Sometimes fear speaks before reason. Sometimes guilt arrives before action. Those psychological realities became part of the legal debate, but they could never erase the image of Akai Gurley lying on the concrete floor fighting for every breath. Soon, emergency medical personnel reached the building. The stairwell that had moments earlier been nearly silent filled with movement as first responders rushed equipment toward the wounded man. Flashlights pierced the darkness that residents had complained about for so long. Radios crackled with urgent updates. Medical professionals worked quickly, assessing injuries and attempting life-saving treatment before transporting him to the hospital. Despite those efforts, the damage proved overwhelming. The bullet had inflicted injuries too severe to overcome. Akai Gurley was pronounced dead a short time later. He was 28 years old. The announcement traveled through his family with devastating speed. A father was gone. A daughter would grow up without him. Melissa Butler's ordinary evening had ended in unimaginable loss. At the same time, Peter Liang's life had also changed forever. The rookie officer who had begun his shift expecting another routine patrol now found himself at the center of an officer-involved shooting that would trigger criminal investigations, internal disciplinary proceedings, public outrage, and years of legal scrutiny. Neither family slept that night as they had expected to. One family prepared to mourn a son, a partner, and a father. The other confronted the reality that a single trigger pull had altered countless lives. Before sunrise, detectives, crime scene investigators, and police supervisors had already begun arriving at the Louis H. Pink houses. Cameras documented every inch of the stairwell. Measurements were taken. Shell casings, bullet fragments, blood evidence, and impact marks were carefully preserved. Investigators understood from the very beginning that this would not be treated as an ordinary shooting. Every physical detail inside that dark staircase would soon become evidence. Every decision made during those final seconds would be examined with extraordinary precision. The search for answers had begun, and it would eventually force an entire city to confront one unsettling question: when tragedy results not from malice, but from a chain of preventable mistakes, where does accountability truly begin? The stairwell no longer resembled the place it had been only an hour earlier. Where silence and darkness had once dominated, bright portable lights now cast harsh white beams across cold concrete walls. Crime scene tape stretched across entrances as investigators carefully documented every inch of the building. Uniformed officers stood watch while detectives moved methodically from one landing to another, aware that every measurement, every photograph, and every observation could later determine the outcome of a criminal trial. Forensic investigations rarely resemble the dramatic scenes portrayed on television. There are no instant conclusions. No brilliant detective immediately identifying the answer. Instead, there is patience. Every detail is preserved before anyone attempts to explain what happened. The first responsibility was to secure the scene. Residents who only hours earlier had been returning home from work now found themselves unable to move freely through their own building. Some watched quietly from apartment windows. Others gathered in hallways, exchanging fragments of information that grew more uncertain with every retelling. Rumors spread quickly. Someone said there had been a gunfight. Someone else insisted an armed suspect had attacked police. Others claimed an innocent man had been shot without warning. Very few people knew the complete story. At that point, neither did the investigators. The stairwell itself became their most reliable witness. Unlike human memory, physical evidence does not become frightened, emotional, or confused. It simply waits to be discovered. Investigators began with the most obvious question. Where had the bullet traveled? Locating the projectile's path required extraordinary precision. Specialists examined the concrete walls using powerful flashlights and laser measuring tools. Before long, they identified an impact mark where the bullet had first struck the wall after leaving Peter Liang's firearm. That discovery immediately changed the understanding of the shooting. The bullet had not traveled directly into Akai Gurley. Instead, it had ricocheted. The concrete surface had altered its trajectory before it continued downward into the lower landing where Gurley was walking. This detail became critically important. It demonstrated that neither officer nor victim had been looking directly at one another when the fatal shot occurred. The staircase itself had become part of the chain of events. Crime scene photographers documented the damaged concrete from every possible angle. Measurements were taken repeatedly to eliminate error. The exact position of the impact mark would later allow forensic experts to reconstruct the bullet's path with remarkable accuracy. Those measurements transformed abstract tragedy into scientific evidence. From there, investigators continued searching for anything capable of explaining why the weapon had discharged. No signs suggested a physical struggle. No evidence indicated that Akai Gurley had threatened either officer. No weapon belonging to the victim was recovered. Those findings quickly narrowed the focus of the investigation. Attention shifted almost entirely toward the actions of Officer Peter Liang. His Glock service pistol was immediately taken into evidence. Firearms specialists would later examine it extensively, testing its mechanical condition and determining whether any malfunction could have caused an accidental discharge. The results proved decisive. The pistol functioned normally. Every safety mechanism operated exactly as designed. The trigger required approximately 11.5 pounds of pressure before the weapon could fire. That amount of force could not be produced accidentally through vibration or by simply dropping the firearm. Someone had pulled the trigger. The question investigators now faced was not whether the gun malfunctioned. It was why the trigger had been pressed. Meanwhile, medical examiners began their own equally important investigation. At the hospital, physicians had already confirmed what everyone feared. Akai Gurley could not be saved. The responsibility now shifted to forensic pathologists, whose task was to determine precisely how he died. Their examination confirmed that the bullet entered his chest after changing direction following the ricochet. The wound was devastating. Despite efforts by emergency responders and medical staff, the injuries were not survivable. Those medical findings would later become another cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Back at the Pink Houses, detectives interviewed the first witnesses. Melissa Butler remained in profound shock. Only a short time earlier she had been walking beside Akai. Now she found herself answering questions she never imagined hearing. Where were you standing? What did you hear? Did anyone say anything before the gunshot? Did you see the officer? Her answers painted a remarkably consistent picture. There had been no warning. No shouted commands. No confrontation. Only the sudden explosion of a gunshot followed almost immediately by Akai collapsing beside her. Other residents described hearing the same deafening blast echo through the building. Several rushed into the stairwell after hearing cries for help. Some witnessed desperate attempts to save Akai's life before emergency personnel arrived. Although individual memories differed in small details, as they often do after traumatic events, the overall sequence remained consistent. The shooting occurred without any preceding struggle. Detectives then turned their attention to Peter Liang and Sean Landor. Officer-involved shootings automatically trigger multiple layers of review within the NYPD. Supervisors documented initial statements while investigators from specialized units prepared formal interviews. Every word mattered. Every recollection would later be compared against forensic evidence. Liang explained that he had become startled after hearing a sound while opening the 8th-floor stairwell door. He stated that his weapon discharged during that startled reaction. The explanation introduced another important question. Why had his firearm already been drawn? Department training and firearm safety procedures would soon become central to the investigation. Experienced firearms instructors consulted by investigators emphasized a fundamental principle repeated throughout police training. A firearm should not be pointed into an unknown area simply because visibility is poor. Darkness alone is not confirmation of danger. That principle, simple in theory, would become one of the most contested aspects of the entire case. Defense attorneys would later argue that officers patrolling dangerous buildings routinely prepared for unpredictable threats. Prosecutors would argue with equal force that preparation could never justify violating basic firearm safety rules. The investigation had only begun, yet those opposing interpretations were already beginning to emerge. As dawn approached over Brooklyn, news of the shooting reached local media outlets. Initial reports were brief. A man had been fatally shot inside a public housing complex. The officer involved remained unidentified. Details were scarce. Questions greatly outnumbered answers. But investigators understood something the public did not yet realize. This case possessed characteristics unlike most officer-involved shootings. The victim appeared unarmed. No exchange of gunfire had occurred. The bullet had ricocheted before striking its target. Those unusual circumstances meant every technical detail would matter. Every inch of the stairwell. Every second of the timeline. Every decision made before and after the trigger was pulled. The investigation was no longer focused solely on a tragic death. It had become a search for the precise sequence of human choices that transformed an ordinary patrol into one of the most controversial police shootings in modern New York history. By sunrise, the stairwell inside the Louis H. Pink houses had become one of the most carefully examined crime scenes in New York City. The darkness that had hidden so much only hours earlier was now gone. Powerful investigative lights illuminated every crack in the concrete, every metal railing, every doorway, and every step leading from one landing to the next. Detectives moved deliberately through the confined space, careful not to disturb evidence that might later answer the questions already spreading across the city. Outside the building, another scene was beginning to unfold. Residents gathered behind police barriers, speaking in hushed voices. Some had known Akai Gurley personally. Others knew only that a man had been shot by a police officer inside their building. Many struggled to understand how such a thing could happen. There had been no reports of a violent suspect. No hostage situation. No exchange of gunfire. Just one shot. One shot that had taken a life. Television crews soon arrived, setting up cameras as the first live reports began appearing on morning broadcasts. At that stage, facts remained limited. Journalists relied on official statements confirming that an NYPD officer had discharged his weapon during a vertical patrol, resulting in the death of an unarmed civilian. The words themselves sounded clinical. The reality was anything but. Inside the investigation, detectives worked backward from the fatal moment, constructing the timeline one piece at a time. Every witness statement was compared against physical evidence. Every officer's radio transmission was logged. Every movement inside the stairwell was measured. Unlike eyewitness memory, forensic evidence follows physical laws. Bullets travel according to velocity and angle. Blood patterns reveal position and movement. Impact marks preserve events long after human recollection begins to fade. The concrete wall where the bullet first struck became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Experts carefully examined the damage left by the ricochet. Using trajectory rods and laser measurements, they reconstructed the bullet's path from Peter Liang's firearm to the point where it struck Akai Gurley. The reconstruction confirmed what many had initially found difficult to believe. The fatal round had never been fired directly at Gurley. Instead, it struck the wall first, changed direction, and then continued into his chest. That finding eliminated one possibility while creating another. If Liang had not aimed directly at Gurley, what exactly had he been aiming at? Or had he been aiming at anything at all? Those questions reached beyond ballistics and entered the realm of judgment. Investigators next focused on the conditions inside the building itself. Residents had repeatedly complained about broken lighting in the stairwells before the shooting. Maintenance records and prior reports revealed a pattern of unresolved issues involving the building's lighting system. Several bulbs had remained out of service, leaving sections of the stairwell in near-total darkness after sunset. Those details mattered. Not because darkness excused what happened, but because it helped explain the environment in which every decision had been made. Crime scene photographs captured conditions remarkably similar to those encountered that night. Images revealed narrow concrete landings where visibility was severely limited and less illuminated by artificial light. For investigators, the photographs answered one question while raising another. If visibility was so poor, should a firearm have been drawn before any specific threat had been identified? That issue soon became central to the investigation. Experienced NYPD firearms instructors were consulted regarding department training standards. They explained that officers are repeatedly taught one of the most fundamental principles of weapon safety: keep your finger off the trigger until you have identified a legitimate threat and have decided that deadly force is necessary. The principle is simple. It is repeated countless times during academy training. It exists because accidental trigger pulls become far more likely when stress, fear, and surprise combine. Detectives now examined whether that principle had been followed. The Glock pistol itself underwent extensive testing. Firearms experts confirmed once again that the weapon required intentional pressure on the trigger to discharge. There was no evidence of a mechanical defect. Nothing suggested the pistol had fired spontaneously. The implication was unavoidable. Human action, not mechanical failure, had produced the fatal shot. Meanwhile, investigators continued interviewing witnesses who had entered the stairwell after hearing Melissa Butler's cries for help. Several residents described scenes of confusion and desperation. Some remembered Melissa kneeling beside Akai, pleading for him to respond. Others recalled neighbors rushing toward the injured man without fully understanding what had happened. The emotional consistency of those accounts left a powerful impression. Nobody described a confrontation between police and Gurley. Nobody reported hearing officers issue commands before the gunshot. Instead, the witnesses described an ordinary evening shattered without warning. Those interviews extended beyond the immediate shooting. Prosecutors also examined what occurred afterward. According to testimony later presented in court, valuable moments passed before effective medical assistance reached Akai Gurley. Questions emerged about the actions taken by the officers immediately following the discharge of the weapon. Did they respond quickly enough? Did confusion delay life-saving aid? Were established emergency procedures followed? Those questions would eventually become nearly as significant as the shooting itself. Defense attorneys would later argue that both officers had experienced an overwhelming psychological shock unlike anything in their careers. Neither had expected the weapon to fire. Both suddenly found themselves confronting a catastrophic emergency for which no amount of classroom instruction could fully prepare them. Prosecutors viewed the same moments differently. In their view, professional responsibility becomes most important during crisis, not least important. Jurors would ultimately hear both interpretations. For now, investigators simply documented the facts. As the first day of the investigation continued, another realization began to emerge. This case would not remain confined to Brooklyn. The circumstances surrounding the shooting touched issues that had already become deeply sensitive across the United States. Public confidence in policing, accountability for officer-involved shootings, and the relationship between law enforcement and minority communities were already subjects of intense national debate. The death of an unarmed black man during what appeared to be a routine police patrol guaranteed widespread attention. Yet this case contained another layer of complexity. Peter Liang was a Chinese-American officer. That fact distinguished the shooting from many other nationally publicized police cases and would later influence public discussion in unexpected ways. Communities that had rarely found themselves on opposite sides of the same debate would soon confront difficult questions about fairness, responsibility, and equal treatment under the law. None of that was yet visible on the first morning. Investigators remained focused on evidence rather than politics. Their task was straightforward, even if the answers were not. Determine what happened. Determine why it happened. Determine whether criminal conduct had occurred. As the hours passed, the stairwell gradually returned to silence. Crime scene technicians packed away cameras and measurement equipment. Detectives carried boxes filled with photographs, diagrams, witness statements, and forensic reports that would soon occupy conference tables inside police headquarters and prosecutors' offices. The physical investigation of the scene was nearing completion. The legal investigation was only beginning. In the weeks ahead, forensic findings would be scrutinized by prosecutors, defense attorneys, firearms experts, police supervisors, and eventually a grand jury. Every photograph taken inside that dark stairwell would become part of a story far larger than anyone standing there on the morning after the shooting could yet imagine. The search for physical evidence had answered many questions. It had also pointed investigators toward one unavoidable conclusion. If the tragedy had not been caused by equipment failure or by an armed confrontation, then the focus had to shift to human decision-making. That shift would soon place Peter Liang himself at the center of an investigation that was rapidly evolving from an internal police review into a potential criminal prosecution. As the crime scene investigation came to an end, the focus shifted away from concrete walls, bullet trajectories, and forensic measurements. The investigation was now about people. Every decision made before, during, and after the gunshot would be examined with extraordinary scrutiny. Detectives from the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office worked alongside investigators from the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau and the Force Investigation Division. Each agency approached the case from a different perspective, but all were searching for the same thing. What exactly had happened inside that stairwell? Officer-involved shootings are unlike most criminal investigations. The physical evidence may be collected in the same manner, but the legal standards are often more complicated. Police officers are legally authorized to carry firearms and, under specific circumstances, to use deadly force. The challenge for investigators is determining whether those circumstances actually existed. In the case of Akai Gurley, that question quickly became the center of every discussion. Detectives began by reconstructing Peter Liang's movements throughout his entire shift. Radio logs established where he and Sean Landor had been assigned. Body positioning inside the stairwell was recreated using diagrams. Every statement given by both officers was compared with forensic evidence to identify inconsistencies. Investigators were not searching for small mistakes in memory. They expected those. Traumatic events often distort precise recollection. Instead, they searched for significant contradictions that might suggest deception. Remarkably, many of the major facts were never seriously disputed. Peter Liang admitted that he had fired the fatal shot. The firearm had discharged while he was holding it. The bullet had ricocheted before striking Akai Gurley. There had been no exchange of gunfire. Gurley had been unarmed. Those foundational facts remained consistent from the beginning. The investigation therefore focused less on establishing who fired the weapon and more on determining whether the shooting resulted from criminal negligence. That distinction carried enormous legal significance. Detectives next turned their attention to NYPD training materials. Firearms instructors, academy supervisors, and experienced patrol officers were interviewed about department policy regarding weapons inside residential buildings. Training manuals emphasized several principles repeated throughout an officer's career. Never point a firearm at anything you are not prepared to shoot. Keep your finger outside the trigger guard until deadly force becomes necessary. Identify the threat before drawing the weapon whenever circumstances permit. These were not obscure recommendations. They represented the foundation of firearm safety. Investigators therefore asked a difficult question. Had Peter Liang violated those principles? The answer appeared increasingly clear. Evidence suggested that his Glock had already been drawn before he encountered any identifiable threat. Even more importantly, prosecutors believed his finger had been resting on the trigger as he opened the heavy fire door leading into the 8th floor landing. That combination dramatically increased the likelihood of an unintended discharge if he became startled. The defense would later challenge the interpretation of some of those findings, arguing that the conditions inside the building required heightened caution and that officers often drew their weapons while moving through dangerous environments. Nevertheless, the investigative team concluded that basic firearm safety remained applicable regardless of location. Darkness did not eliminate those responsibilities. Meanwhile, investigators also examined Peter Liang himself. His personnel file revealed no history of excessive force. No previous officer-involved shootings. No pattern of violent misconduct. In many ways, his record complicated the investigation. Cases involving repeated misconduct often suggest predictable behavior. This case did not. Liang appeared to be a relatively inexperienced officer whose career until that night had been largely uneventful. colleagues described him as quiet and reserved. Supervisors found no evidence that he had entered the building looking for confrontation. Those observations mattered because investigators needed to distinguish between intent and negligence. Nothing suggested intentional murder. The issue was whether his actions had been so careless that criminal responsibility still applied. At the same time, detectives interviewed Sean Landor repeatedly. As Liang's partner, Landor occupied a uniquely important position. He had witnessed nearly every critical moment. Investigators questioned him extensively about their movements through the building, the lighting conditions, the sound Liang claimed to have heard, and what happened immediately after the weapon discharged. Landor's testimony generally supported the sequence already established by forensic evidence. The officers had entered the building for a vertical patrol. The stairwell was extremely dark. The gun discharged almost immediately after Liang opened the 8th floor door. Those facts remained largely consistent. Where interpretations began to differ was in evaluating the officer's response afterward. Prosecutors carefully examined the minutes following the shooting. Witness statements suggested that precious time passed before meaningful medical assistance was provided. Some testimony indicated that confusion and discussion between the officers delayed their response. Those allegations became another important aspect of the investigation. Emergency medicine experts later explained how rapidly blood loss from a gunshot wound can become fatal. Every minute matters. Every decision matters. The investigation therefore extended beyond the shooting itself. It also asked whether professional duties had been fulfilled after the injury occurred. Outside police headquarters, the case was already attracting growing media attention. Journalists obtained maintenance records showing previous complaints about broken stairwell lighting. Community leaders questioned why residents had been forced to navigate dangerous conditions for so long. Civil rights advocates demanded transparency. Police unions urged the public not to rush toward judgment before the investigation concluded. Every new development intensified public interest. Yet inside interview rooms and evidence laboratories, investigators remained focused on facts rather than public opinion. They knew this case would eventually face extraordinary scrutiny. Every conclusion had to withstand challenges from defense attorneys, independent experts, and ultimately a jury. Weeks turned into months as forensic reports continued arriving. Ballistics, autopsy findings, crime scene reconstruction, department training records, personnel files, maintenance complaints, witness interviews. Each piece resembled one fragment of a much larger puzzle. Gradually, a picture emerged. It was neither simple nor comforting. The evidence suggested that no single failure alone had caused Akai Gurley's death. Instead, multiple factors appeared to have converged. A poorly lit stairwell, a rookie officer, a drawn firearm, a finger on the trigger, a startled reaction, a ricochet from a concrete wall. Individually, each element might not have produced tragedy. Together, they became fatal. As prosecutors reviewed the completed investigative file, one unavoidable question remained. Were those combined failures sufficient to justify criminal charges against a New York City police officer? The answer would soon rest not with detectives, but with a grand jury tasked with deciding whether the evidence crossed the threshold from tragic accident to criminal negligence.